Hi, my name's Donn Felker. I'm an independent consultant, and in this Dimecast we're going to extend upon our previous knowledge of Spark partials and go more into an advanced look into Spark partials itself. In the previous example we showed how to use variables with Spark partials as well as just static content with Spark partials. In this example we're going to utilize how to render content from outside of a Spark partial and inject it inside of a Spark partial itself. Now this information isn't well documented on the website, and myself and Lou Desjardins have discussed updating the documentation shortly. However, hopefully this screencast will tide you over until that point in time. If you would like to reference what we're going to cover today, you can view it on sparkviewengine.com and view the elements section. Seen here, elements, and you can go to render partial, and it will cover some of the content I will be covering today. Now, there are certain instances when you're developing applications with Spark View Engine where perhaps you would like to perform maybe a certain type of AJAX, fade in, fade out, slide maneuver, a jQuery slide, etc. Maybe you would like to perform some type of rounded corners based upon some CSS you've written, or maybe through some jQuery library or Scriptaculous, etc. And instead of just applying a class to your div, maybe you would just like to have that div located in one place. And a great place for this would be inside of a Spark partial. Which brings us to the next topic. Previously we discussed that Spark partials always resided within the shared directory over here inside of the views directory of your ASP.NET MVC application. Spark partials can also exist within the views folder itself. If we look inside of the order view folder, we have a shared directory in here. Spark will also look inside of a local shared directory inside of the views folder itself for the Spark partials. So we can see we have different partials in here called do it, foo, rounded corners, something other partial, etc. So let's take for the example that maybe we wanted to have some type of rounded corners. And we decided that for our rounded corners we're going to use some type of library that jQuery provides to round some corners, and to do so we just apply a class called rounded corners to a div element. Now anything that's within inside that div element is going to have some nice rounded corners. However, I don't want to replicate this div and this class and this piece of code 400, 500 times throughout my entire application. I like to have it in one location, and if I need to update it, maybe I want to change the radius of the corners, etc., I only have to do it in one location. That would be the perfect scenario. Spark allows us to do that. Spark provides a render element, and this render element seen here inside of the Spark partial allows us to take something that's from the outside of the Spark partial and inject it directly into where the render element is. So being easier shown than discussed, I'm going to give you this example. So we can say rounded corners, and I'm going to create a close element for rounded corners. So instead of closing it off like this as a normal Spark partial, I'm going to leave it open and close this off, rounded corners. And I'm going to provide some content in the middle. So that would be some content. This could be an image, it could be your text, it could be a list of customers, etc. And you could put a loop around this. Now what this allows us to do is, if we look at example1.spark, what this will do is say, well, now we have some content here. Not a big deal. But if we look at the HTML, this is where it really starts to shine. What we have here is we have div class rounded corners, some content, and then the close div. So what has happened is this content right here, some content, has been injected inside of rounded corners. If you notice, this is inside of this right here. Excuse me, this is inside of the rounded corners div element itself. So some content has now been replaced inside of the render element. So whatever was in that render element has been placed inside of rounded corners. This has a vast, great effect upon what you can do with the extensibility of Spark. Now you can have small little modular components and maybe perform a certain little action that you would like to have done. Maybe it's a message that you would like to display to your end user that when you publish some information in there, it displays it to the end user for 5 seconds, and then a jQuery slide is performed and it slides it out or fades it out to the user. You don't have to worry about anything else other than providing, show. You could have a a partial called show short message, and all you would do is pass the message in, such like this, saying, you know, this is a message, and then what would happen is the jQuery would show it for 5 seconds, and then it would fade it out. And the only thing that you have to know for a development environment is that anytime you'd like to show a message to a user that uses that same type of effect, you provide some small little HTML like this, and Spark takes care of that for you because of it's a partial. Now that'd be a partial that you may either put inside of your view or inside of your shared partials, which would go inside of views shared down here. To take this a step further, let's perhaps say that you might have a partial where you need to put some information at the top, and then you maybe need to have some kind of static information like some horizontal rules or some fancy gradients or whatever, and then you need to put some more content at the bottom. You can do that with Spark as well. So what Spark has here is something I'm calling another thing called rounded.spark, which is maybe taking the rounded example a step further and saying, I have some content up top that I want to place here, and then I always want to say for some reason that this is the middle for whatever reason, and that could be an image, it could be a flashy little under construction sign from 1998 that you love so much that you can't let go of, or it could be the render section bottom. Now the render section bottom is going to be where some content you want to shove at the bottom. So what we're saying is that I want to be able to specify content that should go at the top and content that should show up at the bottom. And so again, just imagine some fancy CSS jQuery rounding action going on up here that uses the class selector to perform that rounding or whatever you may have. Now if we look at the partial render, which utilizes the rounded partial itself, we have the open and the close tags here. Now what we have here is the top, and then we have the bottom. Now the top itself is going to say this text should have rounded corners, and then the bottom actually has something else inside of it, which is very interesting in itself. The bottom itself has some other partial. So now what I'm using is I have now used one partial inside of a named content area called bottom right here. So I have a bottom, and then I say some other partial. Now if we look at some other partial, just says this is some other partial. Woo! Totally awesome, right? So what that will do is render whatever that partial information is right there. So if we go to render partial on this example up here, oops, partial render, excuse me, wrong syntax, excuse me, wrong action. There we see it right here. We said that this is my text that should have rounded corners. That's the top, and that's the bottom. We look at the HTML. There's our fancy jQuery stuff we talked about earlier. So this is my text. This is the middle, which has showed it before. Let's get over here again. There we go. Better view. This is the middle. Here's our horizontal rules again. This is some other partial. So this is pulled from some other partial altogether. So looking at the code again, what we've allowed ourselves to do is shove content into the top, shove content into the bottom, and also use a partial within a partial. So let your mind kind of wrap around that for a little bit, allowing yourself to use maybe a rounded container. Maybe you could have a slide within a rounded container where your div is kind of sliding up and down, moving back and forth depending upon certain parameters of your application. I know a lot of different applications out there that are using this currently, and it works great. Again, my name is Donn Felker, and I'm an independent consultant, and hopefully this small segment on the advanced usage of Spark partials has helped you. Thank you.